On a cold winter evening, the grandeur of a luxury hotel stood in sharp contrast to the bitter streets outside. The entrance shimmered with golden lights, and well-dressed guests stepped out of sleek cars greeted by smiling doormen, holding open the large glass doors. But amid this scene of wealth and comfort, a homeless man stood hesitantly at the edge of the entrance, clutching his tattered blanket tightly around him. His hands were trembling, his face a picture of desperation, as if he must every ounce of courage to take a step forward. As he finally approached the doors, one of the doormen quickly stepped in his way, blocking him with a look of disdain. "You can't come in here," the doorman said sharply, his voice loud enough for others to hear. The man's shoulders slumped as he pleaded quietly, "Please, I just need to ask if someone found my bag. It had everything I own." The doorman cut him off with a cold laugh. "This is not a place for people like you. Move along before I call security." Nearby, unnoticed by the staff, a man in a simple black coat stood observing the scene. His dark eyes studied the exchange, and his calm demeanor masked the storm of emotions brewing inside him. It was Keanu Reeves. And though no one realized it yet, what he was about to do would turn the night and the lives of everyone there completely upside down. This story is about compassion in the face of cruelty, the power of humility, and a moment that would remind everyone of the humanity we often forget. What begins as an act of exclusion becomes a tale of redemption filled with twists, lessons, and an ending that no one could have predicted. The cold wind bit at the man's skin as he stood silently in front of the opulent hotel doors. His clothes, worn and frayed, clung to him in layers that offered little warmth. He clutched a small piece of cardboard under his arm, scribbled with the words "Lost bag, please help," in faint smudged ink. His lips trembled, whether from the cold or fear of humiliation. He wasn't sure. The world around him had always been unkind, but tonight he hoped for just a shred of mercy. The doorman, a tall man with a neatly pressed uniform and an air of authority, towered over him with an unwelcoming glare. "I told you already," he snapped, waving him away as though showing a stray dog, "Go somewhere else. You're making the guests uncomfortable." The homeless man lowered his gaze, his words shaky. "I'm not asking for money or food. Just a minute to check inside. I lost my bag near here yesterday. It has my papers." "My enough," the doorman barked, stepping closer as though his presence alone would intimidate the man into leaving. "This is a luxury establishment, not a charity. If you don't leave now, I'll have you thrown out." The man froze, his dignity slipped, flipping further with each word. Around him, guests arriving at the hotel cast quick glances his way, their faces a mixture of discomfort and judgment. A woman in a designer dress whispered to her companion, "Why doesn't security handle these people before they get to the door?" Her companion shrugged, avoiding eye contact with the homeless man, as if acknowledging his presence would somehow sully their own. A voice from behind the doorman cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" The doorman turned sharply, his annoyance briefly replaced with surprise as he saw the man who had spoken dressed in a simple black coat and jeans. Keanu Reeves stood a few feet away, his hands tucked casually in his pockets. His presence was understated yet commanding, and his calm expression masked the quiet anger simmering beneath the surface. The doorman straightened up, unsure how to address this unexpected observer. "Just handling a situation," he said stiffly. gesturing toward the homeless man as though he were an object rather than a person. This man doesn't belong here. Keanu's eyes shifted to the homeless man, who stood silently, his head bowed in shame. Keanu took a step closer, his voice even but firm. "He not causing any trouble," he said. "Why can't he go?" Inside, the doorman hesitated, his compass you're faltering under Keanu's steady gaze. "Sir, with all due respect, we have standards to maintain. If we let people like him inside, it sets the wrong tone for our guests." Keanu's jaw tightened ever so slightly, but his voice remained calm. "And what tone is that? One where we turn people away because they don't look like us?" The doorman flushed his confidence wavering. A small crowd of guests had gathered nearby, their curiosity piqued by the exchange. Keanu ignored them, his focus entirely on the man standing in front of him. "What's your name?" he asked gently. The homeless man looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and gratitude. "It's Paul," he said quietly. "I'm sorry for causing a scene. I don't have anywhere else to go." Keanu nodded, his expression softening. "You don't need to apologize, Paul. Losing something important is hard enough without being treated like this." Turning back to the doorman, Keanu's voice took on a sharper edge. "Let him in," he said firmly, "or do I need to speak to someone else about this?" The doorman hesitated, his face pale with realization. He didn't know who this man was, but the authority in his tone left no room for argument. Reluctantly, he stepped aside, though his expression made it clear he wasn't happy about it. Keanu placed a reassuring hand on Paul's shoulder. "Come on," he said. "Leighton, find your bag." As they walked through the grand entrance together, the crowd of onlookers parted, their murmurs following behind them. No one knew yet who the man in the black coat was, or why he had stood up for someone society had already dismissed, but they were about to find out, and the truth would leave everyone speechless. As the grand doors closed behind them, Paul hesitated, his steps faltering as he took in the opulence of the hotel's interior. The marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and soft classical music played in the background. The air was filled with the faint scent of fresh flowers, a stark contrast to the cold, biting wind outside. For a man accustomed to the harshness of the streets, the luxury felt almost unreal. Keanu noticed Paul's hesitation and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's just a building, Paul," he said quietly. "No different from any other. You belong here as much as anyone else." Paul nodded weakly, his eyes darting around as if expecting someone to throw him out at any moment. Nearby guests in evening gowns and tailored suits glanced at him with curiosity and thinly veiled judgment. Conversations grew hushed as people whispered among themselves, wondering who this stranger was and why Keanu Reeves had brought him inside. The hotel manager, a tall man in a perfectly tailored suit, approached them quickly, his polished shoes clicking against the marble. His expression was a mixture of confusion and nervousness as he glanced between Keanu and Paul. "Good evening, sir," he said, addressing Keanu with a respectful nod. "Is there a problem?" Keanu's calm demeanor didn't waver. "No problem," he replied. "My friend here lost something near the hotel yesterday. We're just here to ask if anyone found it." The manager's eyes flicked to Paul, and though he tried to hide it, his distaste was evident. "I see," he said slowly. "I'm not sure if anything has been reported, but I can check with the staff." "That would be great," Keanu said, his tone polite but firm. "And while You're at it, maybe you could offer Paul something warm to drink, he's been out in the cold all night. The manager blinked. Momentarily caught off guard, of course. He said, though his reluctance was clear. He signaled to a nearby staff member who hurried off to fetch the drink. Paul shifted uncomfortably, his fingers clutching the edges of his tattered blanket. You don't have to do all this, he murmured to Keanu. I just wanted to ask about my bag. Keanu turned to him, his expression kind but serious. You deserve to be treated with dignity, Paul, he said. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. Before Paul could respond, the staff member returned with a steaming cup of coffee on a silver tray. Paul took it hesitantly, mumbling a quiet thank you as he wrapped his cold hands around the cup. For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of warmth, not just from the coffee but from the unexpected kindness of a stranger. The manager returned a moment later, holding a clipboard. I've spoken to the front desk, he said. It seems someone did find a bag outside yesterday. I'll have it brought here immediately. Paul's eyes widened with relief. Thank you, he said, his voice trembling. It means everything to me. It has all I have left. As they waited, Keanu leaned against the counter, his casual posture a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere around them. Guests continued to stare, their curiosity growing with each passing second. Finally, one of them, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, approached cautiously. Excuse me, the man said, addressing Keanu. I couldn't help but notice. Aren't you Keanu Reeves? Keanu smiled faintly, nodding. That's right. A murmur spread through the lobby, and in several guests began to whisper excitedly. Phones were discreetly raised, cameras capturing the unexpected moment, but Keanu's focus remained entirely on Paul, who was still cradling his coffee like it was a lifeline. The middle-aged man cleared his throat, his curiosity evident. If you don't mind me asking, and why are you helping him? He gestured subtly toward Paul, his tone more puzzled than judgmental. Keanu straightened his expression, thoughtful. Because I can, he said simply, and because someone should. The man seemed taken aback by the answer, as if he had expected something more complex. Keanu's words, though simple, carried a weight that silenced further questions. Moments later, a staff member returned with Paul's bag, a worn but sturdy backpack that had clearly seen better days. Paul's hands trembled as he took it, his eyes filling with tears of gratitude. Thank you, he whispered, clutching the bag tightly to his chest. I don't know how to repay you. You don't need to, Keanu said, his voice gentle. Just take care of yourself, Paul, and don't let anyone make you feel small. As Keanu and Paul turned to leave, the manager spoke up, his tone hesitant. Mr. Reeves, if there's anything else we can do. Keanu paused, glancing back. There is actually, he said, his gaze steady. The next time someone like Paul comes to your door, treat them with respect. You never know who might be watching. The manager nodded quickly, his face pale. Of course, you have my word. As the two men stepped back into the cold night, the warmth of the hotel behind them, Paul looked up at Keanu with tears in his eyes. You didn't have to do any of that, he said. Why did you? Keanu smiled softly, his breath visible in the chilly air. Because no one should have to fight for kindness, he said, and sometimes the smallest act can make the biggest difference. The night was far from over, and the lessons Keanu had imparted would ripple far beyond the hotel's doors. For Paul, this moment wasn't just a stroke of luck, it was the beginning of a journey He never thought possible as they stepped out into the cold night. Paul clutched his reclaimed bag tightly, his fingers gripping the worn straps like a lifeline. The city lights flickered faintly in the distance, and the hum of cars passed by in the background. He looked up at Keanu, his face a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "I don't know how to thank you," Paul said, his voice trembling. "I thought people like you, I mean people, don't stop for someone like me." Keanu smiled gently, the corners of his eyes crinkling with warmth. "People like me," he echoed. "Paul, the world has a way of making us think we're different, but deep down we're all the same. I've been where you are, lost, invisible, wondering if anyone cares, and when someone showed me kindness, it changed everything." Paul frowned slightly, surprised by the vulnerability in Keanu's voice. "You, but you're," he hesitated, searching for the right words. "You're famous, you have everything." Keanu shook his head, his gaze thoughtful. "Fame doesn't fix everything, Paul. Everyone has their battles, even if you can't see them. That's why I believe in helping where I can. It's the least we can do for each other." Paul's grip on his bag loosened slightly as his shoulders relaxed. For the first time in years, he felt like someone truly saw him, not as a problem, but as a person. Keanu motioned toward a small diner at the corner of the street. "Come on," he said, "Leighton, grab a bite. You can't figure out your next step on an empty stomach." Paul hesitated, his pride wearing with his hunger, but the sincerity in Keanu's tone made it impossible to refuse. "All right," he said quietly, "thank you." Inside the diner, the warm glow of the neon lights and the smell of freshly brewed coffee created a welcoming atmosphere. Keanu and Paul took a seat in a corner booth away from prying eyes. The waitress approached, her pen poised over her notepad, but her eyes widened slightly when she recognized Keanu. "Wow, I didn't expect to see you here," she stammered, her face lighting up. "Can I get you something?" Keanu smiled politely, "Just 2 coffees. And whatever your special is tonight, and make it to go, please." The waitress nodded quickly, still starstruck, and hurried off to place the order. Paul watched the interaction with a mix of awe and curiosity. "You really are famous," he said, shaking his head. "I can't believe you're sitting here with me." Keanu chuckled softly. "Fame doesn't make you better than anyone else, Paul. It just gives you a bigger platform to make a difference." Paul looked down at the table, his fingers tracing the cracks in the old laminate. "I used to have a job, you know," he said suddenly. "A good one. I was a mechanic, had my own shop even, but then things fell apart." Keanu leaned forward slightly, his expression attentive. "What happened?" Paul sighed, his shoulders sagging. My wife got sick. We spent everything we had on her treatment when she passed." His voice broke, and he paused to collect himself. "When she passed, I couldn't keep the shop. I couldn't keep anything. I ended up here on the streets, just surviving." Keanu's eyes softened, his heart aching for the man sitting across from him. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "That must have been incredibly hard." Paul nodded, his gaze distant. "It was, and after a while people stop seeing you. They look through you like you're not even there. You start to believe it yourself." The waitress returned with their order, setting the steaming cups of coffee in 2 brown paper bags on the table. Keanu handed her a generous tip, offering a kind smile as she walked away. He turned back to Paul, sliding one of the bags across the table. "You're not invisible, Paul," he said firmly. "And it's never too late to turn things around." Paul stared at the bag, his hands trembling as he reached for it. But how? I've been stuck in this hole for so long. I don't even know where to start. Keanu leaned back, his expression thoughtful. Sometimes all you need is a little help to get back on your feet. Tell me, if you could start over, what would you want to do? Paul blinked, the question catching him off guard. He hadn't allowed himself to dream in years. I don't know, he said hesitantly. Maybe open another shop, fix cars again. I was good at that. Keanu nodded slowly. Then that's where we'll start. Paul frowned, confusion etched across his face. What do you mean? Keanu smiled, his eyes glinting with determination. I'll help you get back on your feet, Paul. A new shop, a fresh start. But you have to promise me one thing. Paul leaned forward, his voice shaking with hope. Anything when you're back on your feet. You help someone else, Keanu said simply. That's how we keep the cycle going. Paul's eyes filled with tears as he nodded. I promise, he whispered. In that moment, the warmth of the diner seemed to envelop them both, a beacon of hope in a world often too cold. Paul didn't know how, but for the first time in years he believed that better days were ahead. Over the next few days, Keanu stayed true to his word. Early one morning, a car pulled up near the small park where Paul had been sleeping, the same black car that had stopped outside the hotel a few nights ago. Paul, still clutching his blanket, stood up nervously as Keanu stepped out holding a thermos of coffee in a brown bag. Good morning, Keanu greeted, handing Paul the bag and thermos. Breakfast first, and then we're going to get some things done. Paul opened the bag to find a fresh sandwich and a note tucked inside it read, every sunrise is a chance to start again. He glanced up at Keanu, a small grateful smile breaking through his normally guarded expression. What are we doing today? Paul asked, curiosity mingled with hesitation. Keanu motioned toward the car. We're going to give you a fresh start. Their first stop was a small but bustling mechanic shop on the edge of the city. The sign above the door read, Harrison Auto Repairs. Inside, the sound of tools clinking and engines revving filled the air. A burly man in overalls greeted them at the counter. Keanu, long time no see, he said with a grin, wiping grease off his hands. Hey Harrison, Keanu replied, shaking his hand. I've got someone I want you to meet. Keanu introduced Paul, who stood awkwardly by the door, unsure of his place in the conversation. Paul here is a great mechanic, Keanu explained. He just needs a chance to get back on his feet. Think you can help him out? Harrison looked Paul up and down, his eyes sharp but kind. You ever worked on imports? And he asked, cutting straight to the point. Paul nodded quickly. I've worked on everything. Imports, domestics, you name it. Harrison grunted, clearly impressed. All right, we're short-handed this week. Anyway, come back tomorrow and I'll see what you can do. Paul's jaw dropped. Really, just like that? Harrison shrugged. You're either good or you're not. We'll find out soon enough. Paul turned to Keanu, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to thank you. Keanu clapped him on the shoulder. Thank Harrison, he said with a grin, and show him what you've got. And their next stop was a thrift store where Keanu helped Paul pick out a few new shirts, a pair of sturdy boots, and a warm jacket. Paul protested at first, uncomfortable with the attention and generosity, but Keanu wouldn't hear. You can't walk into a new job looking like the past is still holding you back, Keanu said firmly. This is about moving forward. By the time they left, Paul looked like a different man. He stood a little straighter, his shoulders less hunched, as though he was finally starting to believe in himself. Again that evening as they sat on a park bench overlooking the city, Paul turned to Keanu. "Why are you doing all this for?" "Me," he asked. "You don't even know me." Keanu gazed out at the skyline, his expression thoughtful. "Because someone did it for me once," he said softly, "and because I know what it's like to feel like the world has given up on you." Paul nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. "I won't waste this chance," he said, his voice steady. "I promise." Keanu smiled. "I know you won't." The next morning Paul arrived at Harrison's shop, his heart pounding with nervous anticipation. Harrison handed him a pair of gloves and pointed to a car on the lift. "Let's see what you've got," he said. Roughly within minutes Paul was in his element, his hands moved with practiced ease, diagnosing the issue and explaining it to Harrison with a confidence he hadn't felt in years. By the end of the day, Harrison slapped him on the back. "You're hired," he said simply. "Don't make me regret it." Paul couldn't stop the grin that spread across his face. It wasn't just a job, it was a lifeline. Well, that evening Paul sent Keanu a text. "I got the job, thank you for everything." Keanu replied almost immediately, "Congratulations, the rest is up to you. Now keep going." For the first time in years Paul felt like he had a future, a real chance to rebuild the life he thought he had lost. And it all started with a single act of kindness. Months passed and Paul's life transformed in ways he had never imagined. He worked tirelessly at Harrison's shop, pouring his heart into every car he repaired. Customers appreciated his honesty and skill, and word quickly spread about the new mechanic who treated every job with the care of someone rebuilding his own life. Harrison, initially skeptical, soon became one of Paul's biggest supporters, often boasting about him to anyone who would listen. Paul saved every penny he could, and soon he rented a small apartment. Nothing fancy, but it was his. For the first time in years, he had a place to call home. He hung a picture of his late wife on the wall, her smile reminding him of why he was fighting so hard to rebuild his life. One evening as Paul closed up the shop, he noticed a young man sitting on the curb outside. The man's clothes were tattered, and his face was etched with the same hopelessness Paul had carried not long ago. Paul approached him cautiously, holding out a bottle of water. "You okay, kid?" Paul asked gently. The young man looked up, his eyes weary. I don't know where else to go," he admitted. "I just lost my job and everything's falling apart." Paul sat down beside him, the memories of his own struggles flooding back. "I know how that feels," he said quietly, "but I also know it gets better. Sometimes you just need someone to believe in you." The young man glanced at Paul, surprised. "Why are you talking to me? Most people just walk by." Paul smiled faintly, the weight of his own journey reflected in his eyes. "Because someone helped me once and now it's my turn." Meanwhile Keanu continued to check in on Paul from time to time, though always from a distance. He didn't need recognition or gratitude, just knowing Paul was thriving was enough. One afternoon he received a text from Paul. "The first helped someone today just like you helped me. Thank you for showing me how." Keanu smiled as he read the message, his heart swelling with quiet pride. He knew that Paul's story was no longer just his own. It was part of a larger ripple effect, one that would continue to spread as long as kindness existed in the world. A few months later Paul was invited to speak at a community event hosted by Harrison's shop. Nervous but determined, he stood in front of a small crowd and shared his story, the struggles the losses, and the unexpected kindness. That changed his life. I thought I was invisible, Paul said, his voice steady but emotional. I thought no one cared, but one person did, and because of him I'm standing here today. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: never underestimate the power of a small act of kindness. It can change everything. The crowd erupted into applause, and Paul felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known in years. He spotted Keanu standing quietly at the back of the room, his hands tucked in his pockets and a faint smile on his face. Their eyes met, and Keanu gave him a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of how far he had come. As the event ended, Paul approached Keanu, his heart full of gratitude. I don't know how to thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You didn't just change my life, you gave me a reason to believe again. Keanu placed a hand on Paul's shoulder, his expression calm but warm. You did the hard work, Paul. I just gave you a little push. Paul smiled, his eyes glistening. I'll keep paying it forward, I promise. Keanu nodded. That's all I ask. As Keanu walked away into the evening light, Paul stood there watching the man who had changed his life with a single act of compassion. He knew he would never forget what Keanu had done for him, but more importantly, he knew it was now his turn to carry the torch. The shop, the community, and Paul's life were all forever changed, not just because of Keanu's kindness, but because of the ripple effect it created. And as Paul looked out at the crowd of people who had come to hear his story, he realized that sometimes the smallest moments can leave the biggest impact. Kindness, like a spark, has the power to ignite an endless flame, and Paul's was just beginning.